Hi, this is the response to MannixthePirate's video on rape and genetic exchange about Genghis Khan, basically. I just want to spend a couple of minutes talking about the Genghis Khan hypothesis, and then I want to just see if I can find a way to swing this conversation out of rape for my own purposes and towards some discussions that I had recently with TJ and one or two other people about pre-state societies, see if I can find a way of bringing that into the mix. And then I want to just say a couple of words about your first video on this subject, Mannix, which I think you made a good point in that first video, which is a difficult point, which is in danger of being overlooked. So I thought I'd just try and find a way of weaving that in as well. I mean, the first thing about Genghis Khan, I mean, what I'd like to do, if I can, is to try and start with the same data that you've got and see if I can run an alternative interpretation through it. I mean, what you're saying basically is that when Genghis Khan was the leader of the biggest gang in town 800 years ago, and basically swept through Asia, raping and pillaging with him and his mates as much as possible. The result of that was that, whatever it was, 1.5% of the human race are now got the bit of the Y chromosome that corresponds to Genghis. And what you're saying there is that's evidence for the survival value of a kind of rape gene. I'm simplifying for effect, but you know what I mean. That kind of behaviour persists in the population because something about it is genetically coded for, probably indirectly, and that's how it goes. I think there's a different interpretation to be made there, actually. I mean, firstly, Genghis Khan was a mature, modern human, capable of language and consciousness and planning. And obviously was particularly good at planning. You don't get to rule half the world without being a reasonably good organizer. And he wasn't. I'm sure he was a very passionate bloke, like the rest of us are, but he wasn't driven by his passions. He was driven by his conscious aims that he'd set for himself. And one of those aims was undoubtedly world domination, and with himself cast in the role of the populator of that world. So when he went across Europe and across Asia and did that, he wasn't raping every woman he met because he was filled with an uncontrollable passion. It was a breeding program, basically, with himself as the sole semen donor, or him and his close mates as the semen donors, and the whole population of women across Asia as the brood mares for that program. So it's more an example of kind of animal husbandry, or of kind of positive eugenics, rather than the operation of genetics working its way through passions. And because of that, it's not natural selection. It's the opposite of natural selection. What his program there is artificial selection. He was doing basically what farmers do every day of the week, which is culling the weak, what they perceive to be the weak males out, so that preferential males can have access to the females. I mean, that's basically what his program was. It's not natural selection, it's artificial selection. To do that, it requires consciousness, it requires a complex mind, it requires a certain kind of rationalism, not rational in the moral sense, but rational in the sense of being able to think and plan, and a highly evolved mind. So if there's anything, if evolution is at all to blame for this, it's the evolution of our conscious ability to plan those kinds of reprehensible acts, not the underpinnings of our desires, really, I would say. I think it's a more realistic interpretation. But you can disagree, and I'm just speculating with the same data, so it has no more authority than that speculation. Okay, I wanted just to mention briefly this idea of a pre-state society. I was talking with TJ about this recently in relation to Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan, the idea that we have a state, we have a government, we have all those organisations of government of which you're a part, of course, and the police force and the civil service and all those kind of things. We have that in a way to kind of protect us from ourselves, to protect the weaker members of our society from the stronger members, to stop the biggest gang in town being the boss, really. That's the idea of a civil society, and that's the idea of a state. But of course that wasn't the case in Genghis Khan's time, and he was quite literally just a gang leader, a very successful gang leader, because that's the nearest thing to states were. It would be like parts of Somalia now. If you go to parts of Somalia now, there is no state. you're effectively negotiating with warlords and tribal gang leaders. That's your life, and that's not the only place on the planet. Many places in our planet are like that, and many even the most civilized societies now have the potential to become that very quickly, I suspect. I don't know if the reports are true, but my understanding is that some of the events at least, that took place in the Astrodome just after the flooding of New Orleans, gave some indication of how fast those things can happen when state is dissolved, and some kind of version of survival of the fittest takes over. I don't want to make too crude an analysis there, but if you were in the Astrodome for those 2 or 3 days, and and your kid was with you, and there was no drinking water, and the only access was drinking water, was to go and chat to that gang of 20-year-old men over there with tattoos on their hands, then that's what you would have to do. And that's pretty much what the whole world was like up until about less than 1,000 years ago. A lot less than 1,000 years ago. You were basically living as a hunter-gatherer. That means living in Somalia or living in the Astrodome forever. And that's what it was like under Genghis Khan. So so it's operating in a really different frame. That's obviously not an excuse, but it's in that kind of a situation that certain kind of people rise to power. They do say that cream and bastards rise, but prior to state societies, prior to the development of modern states, it was just the bastards that rise. So I'm not entirely surprised that a bastard like Genghis Khan would become the boss of the gang and would think it perfectly okay to mount that kind of a breeding program. Actually, I've just thought that there's a kind of counter-argument there. Given that Genghis Khan did that, and he was clearly, at least, if not a psychopath, then psychopathic enough to carry out those things he did, given that 1.5 of the population of the planet now contains a large portion of his genes, it's interesting to observe that 1.5% of the population are not rampaging hordes of maniacs, as far as I'm aware. All right, what else? So yes, pre-state societies. That's all I've got to say on this video. Thanks very much for that. It's very useful. But I just want to cut to your first one, which was about I can't remember what it was called, to be honest. Rape and evolution, something like that. But there's something that you said on there, which I know raised the hackles on a number of other people, and it did take me back a bit, I must say, when I heard it, which was this thing that he didn't say it in these words. I'm taking you out of context a bit, but he said something like, I don't really care about rape victims, or you don't feel sorry for rape victims, and then you made this analogy with the Monopoly board. That I can't go into the details of it, but the idea was that you didn't have a great deal, you weren't a bleeding heart about the rape victims, and you were taken to task on that. I know. And I think it's quite interesting. I mean, in some ways. I can understand why, because he did come up with a bit of an arsehole. But at the same time, I think there's a really interesting point there, which is that we're not supposed to take feelings into account, really. I mean, it doesn't matter whether you or anybody else feels sorry for somebody, or feels sympathy, or feels empathy, or loses sleep over it, or cries yourself to sleep every night. It doesn't matter at all, really. If we are living in a decent civilized society, it shouldn't matter. What's important is, of course, that you don't propagate those acts yourself. I mean, that should be the only moral judgment. If I am judging you, or someone else is morally judging you, according to whether you feel a certain thing about the victim of a crime or not, then that's a kind of emotional Stalinism, and that's wrong. We can't go there, really. I can't judge your morality based on whether you feel something or not. I can only judge you on whether you do something or not. So I think it's a really important distinction to make. In fact, I would go further than that. I would say that, in a sense, we only need morality at all because quite often we don't feel things that we're perhaps supposed to. And sometimes it's just impossible to feel things. If I can take it away from rape and find some simpler crimes to talk about, most of us, and myself included, don't feel a great deal of sympathy for the victims of corporate crime, or for the victims of people who download music from websites, or for petty acts of fraud, taking pencils home from the post office or whatever it may be. Most people don't feel sympathy for those things, but we kind of know they're morally wrong, even though we don't have feelings attached to it. And that's the mark of a civilization, our ability to recognize something as morally wrong, even though we don't feel it. Because quite honestly, if we all felt that something was wrong, we wouldn't need morals, we just wouldn't do bad things. The fact that our feelings aren't always a good guide to morality, to what's right and wrong, is why we need a morality. And so I think that's kind of behind your story there, even though it wasn't on the surface, but I think it's an important point. That's all I've got to say, I think. Anyway, thanks very much for that.